James Madison by Matthew Kymn. James Madison was born on March 16, 1751, in Port Conway, Virginia. He was raised on a plantation and grew up in Orange County, Virginia. James Madison was the oldest of 12 children, but sadly, only 7 of his siblings lived to adulthood. He was sent to a boarding school in 1762, run by Donald Robertson, located in King and Queen County, Virginia, and returned to his father's estate 5 years later because his father was worried about his health. His father, who was also named James, was a very successful planter, owning more than 3,000 acres of land and dozens of slaves. 2 years later, after his private tutoring at home, James Madison finally went to college in 1769 at the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton University. There, Madison studied Latin, Greek, science, and philosophy, among many other subjects. Madison graduated in 1771, however, he stayed on a while longer to continue his studies. Madison finally returned to Virginia in 1772 and was elected to the Orange County Committee of Safety in 1774. The following year, he became a colonel of the Virginia militia. Then, in 1780, he went to Philadelphia to serve as one of Virginia's delegates in the Continental Congress. Later, Madison returned to Virginia in 1783. There, he helped get Virginia's Statute of Religious Freedom, which was later passed in 1786. In 1787, Madison represented Virginia at the Constitutional Convention as a Federalist, which means he campaigned for a strong central government. In the Virginia Plan, he expresses ideas about forming a 3-part federal government, consisting of an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. He also thought it was important for this new structure to have a system of checks and balances in order to prevent the abuse of power by any one group. James Madison was probably the one who was the most involved during the Constitutional Convention. By September of 1787, Madison had emerged from the Constitutional Convention as the most impressive and persuasive voice in favor of a new constitution. Madison wrote majority of the Constitution, with most of his ideas included in it. In addition, Madison helped modify the Articles of Confederation, wrote about 1/3 of the Federalist Papers, and wrote all of the Bill of Rights. In 1789, Madison won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Later, in 1791, he founded the Democratic Republican Party with Thomas Jefferson. Then, on September 15, 1794, he marries Dolly Payne Todd. In 1801, Madison serves as President Jefferson's Secretary of State. His presidency. During the election of 1808, James Madison ran against Federalist Charles C. Pinckney and Independent Republican George Clinton and won by a huge margin, winning 70% of the electoral votes. Immediately, James Madison had to start dealing with Native Americans and their leader Tecumseh. The Native Americans and the Americans had many disputes in the Western Territory. The Americans were settling on Native American lands, and this caused problems for the Native Americans. Native American population decreased, and the power of their leaders declined. Tecumseh would not stand for this, and he began urging Native American resistance. He called on Native Americans to preserve traditional ways and organized the Western tribes into a league to restore lands. He traveled widely to spread the message. American officials were deeply concerned by Tecumseh's activities. William Henry Harrison decided to take action. While Tecumseh was traveling in search of allies, Harrison marched 1,000 soldiers against the Shawnee villages on the Tippecanoe River. In the Battle of Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison defeated the Native Americans. Besides dealing with the Native Americans, another domestic issue James Madison had to deal with was rechartering the Bank of the United States, whose charter was scheduled to terminate in 1812. The move to recharter the bank met opposition from 3 sources. It which were old Republicans who viewed the bank as unconstitutional and a stronghold of Hamiltonian power, anti-British Republicans who objected to the substantial holdings of bank stock by Britons, and state banking interests opposed to the U.S. bank's power to control the nation's financial business. Despite all this, in 1816, with Madison's support, the second bank was chartered with a 20-year term. During James Madison's presidency, the Embargo Act was repealed in 1809, and a new act called the Non-Intercourse Act was introduced and reduced the trade embargo down to Britain and France. When neither country responded to the Non-Intercourse Act, Congress passed Macon's Bill No. 2, which removed all trade restrictions and allowed to impose any restrictions on French and British trade. Congress then voted for military preparations, and in April 1812, a 90-day embargo. President Madison lifted the following complaints against the British: the oppressment of American sailors, arms to Indians who attacked the American settlers, and trade restriction. Eventually, in June of 1812, the United States had declared war on Britain. Both countries had disadvantages at the beginning of the war. The British were still at war with Napoleon and the French, while the American army was weakened from former President Jefferson's spending cuts. It did not look good for the Americans at the start of the war. One American force had surrendered at Detroit, another had been defeated in western New York near the Niagara Falls, and a third force never managed to get across the Niagara River. However, things went better for the Americans in the spring of 1813, when Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry wins a victory for the Americans over the British fleet in the southwestern tip of Lake Erie. This forced the British to retreat back to Canada. As the British and their Native American allies retreated, the Americans under General William Henry Harrison pursued them. They followed the British into Canada, defeating them in the Battle of Thames. General Harrison has won another successful victory for the Americans. In the following spring of March of 1814, General Andrew Jackson slaughtered what was left of Late Tecumseh's forces at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. In 1814, British finally defeated Napoleon. This allowed Britain to send many more troops across the Atlantic to fight against the United States. Later that year, in August 1814, the British marched into the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and burned down the White House. The British then moved on to Baltimore. Their objective was to attack Fort McHenry, which defended the city's harbor. British warships bombarded the fort throughout the night of September 13, 1814. However, they were unsuccessful in winning this war. In fact, the American flag was still flying over the fort. It was this battle that inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner, which later became our national anthem. Finally, on Christmas Eve of 1814, the two sides signed the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812. However, news of this treaty took several weeks before it reached the United States, and in that time the two sides fought one more battle. In January of 1815, American forces under General Andrew Jackson won a victory over the British at the Battle of New Orleans, even with his lower numbers of 4,000 regular soldiers compared to the British Army of 6,000 soldiers. James Madison left office in 1817 and returned with his wife Dolly to Montpelier. He kept himself busy by running the plantation and serving on a special board to create the University of Virginia, with the help of Thomas Jefferson. The school opened up in 1825 with Jefferson as its rector. But when Thomas Jefferson died, Madison became head of the university. Sadly, many years later, James Madison died on June 28, 1836. James Madison was the fourth president of the United States and had an outstanding legacy that helped shape this amazing nation. As one of the founding fathers, he was part of the birth of America as a nation, and he was probably the most influential founding father. As the father of the Constitution, he ensured that this nation would become whole, united, and most importantly, in the hands of the people. And as a huge force behind the Bill of Rights, he empowered and inspired the people. He also rechartered the National Bank and served 2 terms as president. He also gave the new nation a sense of national pride and secured independence from Britain by winning the War of 1812. James Madison was regarded as a small, quiet, intellectual person. He used the depth and breadth of his knowledge to create a new type of government. His thoughts and ideas shaped the nation and established the rights that Americans still use today.